Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Harold here with another episode of Those Were Days Extended. Today I am actually taking you back to January 28th, 2004, and this was when Marlena was revealed to be the Salem Stalker. This actually will probably go down as one of Days' greatest plot points. It was a true umbrella storyline and a complete shock when the killer was revealed. I personally remember this, not only the storyline, of course, but I remember that day watching the show. And then, if I remember correctly, those of you who remember the storyline, Marlena was drugged into sort of hashing out this revenge scheme. Excuse me, perpetrated by Tony slash Andre at the time, and she had just Tony had just been mauled by a tiger, and someone was standing over his bed, and it was going to be the reveal of like the killer. We were going to see who the killer was after, and this was God, maybe at least about 6 months of storyline had progressed at this point, and they pan up and it's like, oh shit, who's the killer, and they reveal it's Marlena. And I tell you, it was like a true shocking moment of like, oh, this is shocking and like off-putting, but also like intriguing, and ooh, how is this storyline gonna play out? But again, it will go down as one of Days' greatest, not only because of that killer reveal, but also because of what was going on at the time. And we'll get into a little bit of the behind the scenes a little later, but to start off, remember the storyline. Basically, some of our most prominent Salem residents were basically getting killed off. And just to put some context, this was before Days had sort of been known to kill people off and bring them back. And of course, we sort of make fun of it now of if someone gets killed, are they really dead? Is Dr. Rolf going to revive them, or are they going to show up 6 or 8 months later? This was way before that. This is the early 2000s. This is when that sort of plot point is not associated with Days necessarily. So these 10 characters were getting picked off and actually killed. And I think the response was very heavy at the time. It was very ratings driven. And I'll just give you a little reminder of the 10 people who sort of succumbed and who we thought as viewers we were saying goodbye to in the moment. The first one, of course, was Abe, who was gunned down. Then we had Jack and Maggie, who were bludgeoned to death. We had Cassie, who was stabbed and stuck in a pinata. We had Roman, who was killed on his wedding day to Kate, if you remember that infamous scene of her coming back into, I think it was Chez Rouge at the time, and her dress is just covered in blood because she found Roman. It was Caroline and Doug were amongst the victims. And we even had Victor, who, if you remember, was actually not killed by the Salem Stalker, but he was actually killed by Jan Spears with an assist from Nicole. But they actually sort of framed the crime scene and sort of threw him in with the victims there so they can sort of get away with the crime of killing him. And then we had, of course, Tony, who was Andre at the time, it would later be revealed, he was mauled by a tiger that was let loose by Marlena, i.e. the Salem Stalker. We had Marlena being killed as the killer in a showdown with the police. And then we had, honestly, the most shocking and egregious of the deaths, and that was the death of little old sweet Alice Horton, who choked to death on her own donut. And not only choked to death, but she was force-fed by Marlena at the time, who was a Salem Stalker. And just to spend a minute here with this storyline, again, remember watching this, you were hanging on every word to see who was going to, if one of your favorites was going to get killed off. And, you know, you're sort of hoping it's not this person versus that person. And then when it came to this portion where it seemed like Alice Horton was going to be a target, I know me definitely, and I think a lot of other people were sort of looking at it as, oh, this is where Marlena, whatever is going on with Marlena, we didn't know at the time, but we're like, this is where Marlena gets caught. You know, they're not going to kill Alice Horton. This is the point where someone's going to run in at the last minute, or Alice is going to get away somehow and get to the police, or someone's going to interrupt this sort of moment or this killing, perhaps. And then it didn't happen. She actually killed Alice Horton, which was, again, all of these killings were a shock when they happened, just because I think Abe's was such a shock too, because it was the beginning of it. And it was like, what are we in for here? I didn't know, Abe's a beloved character. How can they kill him? How can they kill Jack? How can they kill Maggie? And then of course we get to Alice Horton, and it was just like all bets are off. Like, and the consensus seemed to be that they were trimming the cast and getting rid of a lot of people. But we'll get into a little bit more of that a little later and how all of that sort of came to be and sort of the little controversy that was surrounding that. But yeah, that was the setup of the storyline back then. And then this is also, if you remember, those of you, a little bit of a deep cut Easter egg here. This was actually the origin of the Dr. Rolf serum. And I know it didn't play a huge factor here. It was sort of a little bit of a byproduct where Marlena was killing these victims, and then the coroner, we later learned Andre had paid off the coroner to come in and say that they were dead. They were basically in this sort of deep, sort of not sleep, but state that rendered them sort of motionless, we'll say. But this was the sort of the origin of that serum that we know and love. Sort of now that, every time someone gets killed, we think Dr. Rolf can bring them back. This is actually where it started. It was the early 2000s. This particular storyline, they later took that serum and then incorporated it into the show. At least 10 years later, when we started to get sort of what Days is known for now, with bringing people back from the dead and sort of this get out of jail free card with the Rolf serums. But yeah. Those of you who remember, that was actually the origin of it, was this storyline, the Salem Stalker storyline. But fast forward now, and again, give you a little context. This storyline from not start to finish, but start to where Abe was the first victim, to where we get to the point now, which I'll get into in a moment, the Mela Swan portion, that was a total of almost a year. It was like 9.5, roughly 10 months of storyline. So again, our favorite characters are getting sort of killed off. And then here we have the big reveal is that all 10 victims in Marlena were all actually alive on a remote island that was a complete replica of Salem called Mela Swan, which many of you know is New Salem spelled backwards. And then it was revealed, of course, that Tony was really Andre and that this was this elaborate revenge scheme that he was taking on the residents of Salem and to sort of pick them off one by one. And he did that by sort of brainwashing Marlena into, quote unquote, killing them at the time. Again, one of the most famous storylines, not only for this portion here, but it continued on, and there were so many repercussions where I want to take a minute and sort of get into those. So I think those ended up being some of the most interesting part, while these 10 victims were sort of off screen and on this island per se, that we had a lot going on in Salem at the time. And what we got from this particular portion of the storyline was we got some of the repercussions where we had Lexi and Tech. Remember when Abe was killed, Lexi grieved him. She got into a relationship with Tech. Abe comes back. She basically starts an affair with Tech because she had these unresolved feelings for him. It was dating him when Abe came back, but thought getting back with Abe was the honorable thing to do. We have her in a, again, relationship and then the ultimate affair with Tech. We remember that one. We remember that this is where the origin of Bonnie came from. Bonnie, because Maggie was killed, of course, they sort of brought in Bonnie as the maid and put her with Mickey at this point. So that origin of Bonnie and expanding the Lockharts. We also got Patrick Lockhart, which I talked about in another Those Were the Days Extended. This is the origin of where he comes in. He comes in as an extension of Bonnie and the Lockhart family. We had John and Kate, who were together as a couple, which is personally one of my favorites because Roman and, of course, Marlena were off canvas at this time. They got together and actually became an engaged couple before sort of Roman and Marlena came back into the picture. We also had Rex and Kate becoming close as mother and son and sort of bonding over the fact that Cassie and Roman were murdered. And then last but not least, we got the unforgettable pregnancy storyline with Marlena when she does come back and we find out that she is actually pregnant by Roman because her and Roman saw that John and Kate had basically moved on without them in their grief. And they decided that if they were not going to be able to get back to Salem to them, that they would sort of find comfort in each other. And we got that sort of storyline that just took us in a whole different direction. It actually led us into the Alex North storyline, which I'm sure I will cover in a later episode. But yeah, while all of these things were going on, not only was it the plotline of these beloved characters being killed, but it was also how the other residents were sort of moving on with their lives. And then for these 10 to come back and put them in the mix with this new sort of Salem or new sort of life that, their loved ones had been living for the past almost a year. Was a lot of storyline to sort of mine over the years. Another thing that popped up, this is actually the official time period where Deidre Hall took over the role as Hattie Adams. If you remember, the original iteration of Hattie was actually played by Andrea Hall, which is Deidre Hall's twin sister. And then Andrea Hall actually retired from acting. She sort of didn't want to come back. I think they asked her. She said no, she's retired. She kind of was into other things with her life at this point. And so, of course, then the next best thing is to get Deidre Hall to sort of play off this character in a one-off. And I think I don't think they thought that, they had room for this character, that this character was going to come back in a bigger way years later. Of course, they didn't know it's at this time, but I think it was just looked at as a one-off for sort of Deidre to have some fun here. And the genesis of this was John, of course, was very, let me say, obsessed with clearing Marlena's name from being the Salem Stalker. And he was sort of trying to figure out who could have done this, and he sort of came on the idea that it was possibly Hattie who had been the stalker. So he tracks down Hattie, he brings her back to the hospital to confront her in front of everyone. And that's when we see that it's actually Deidre Hall taking over the role as Hattie here. Now, give you a little bit of behind the scenes at this time. There's so much debate that goes back and forth with this storyline. I think that for all intents and purposes, it actually was ratings gold. I think Days was at a point where it was on the brink of cancellation. And what happened is the powers that be sort of came in and they enlisted James Riley, who had been previous writer on the show. We know he famously, the Devil Possession storyline, he had moved on and was doing Passions at the time. Days was in a ratings trouble. It was on the brink of cancellation. They went back to James and said, we need you to come back. We need you to write something. We need one last sort of ditch effort to sort of get the ratings up and to increase viewership here. So James came up with this Salem storyline. Again, he was doing double duty on Passions. There were a ton of criticism of the storyline. Again, even though it was ratings gold, a lot of it was criticism of killing off a lot of the older cast members to make room for, in their eyes, younger models who weren't experienced and were new to the scene, and they're changing the show too much. I think a lot of fans saw it as too over the top and outlandish, including one of the show's biggest fans, Pretty Woman herself, Miss Julia Roberts, even commented saying that the storylines had gotten a little wacky with this sort of plot line here. But James Riley sort of defended it. He said, the show was in serious trouble and need to be shaken up, that they need to do something drastic to get viewers. And then here's where there's a little bit of controversy and back and forth over the years. There's no way to tell if the Meliswan portion was actually intended during the whole time, or if it was added later after the backlash of the original actors being fired. What we do know is a couple of the actors, specifically Francis Reed, rest in peace, and Matt Ashford, actually did reveal later in interviews that their contracts were not put on hold, that they were actually fired. So when their characters were killed off the show, they were actually 100% let go from the show. There was no sort of talk or understanding or agreement that they would be brought back later on. So again, there's controversy there whether the Meliswan stuff was always planned and it was something that was kept between James Riley and the powers that be and the actors weren't told about it, or did the Meliswan portion come because there was such fan outrage over the fact that their beloved characters, Abe, Francis Reed, Matt Ashford, Josh Taylor, were sort of killed off, and this was sort of their way of kind of backpedaling and sort of getting like a do-over from, you remember the infamous sort of Dallas season where they had Bobby sort of wake up from a dream, and the whole last season was sort of the whole last season was a fake, and that's how they got around it. This was kind of Days' version of it. Again, up until this point, other shows had done this. Days had never experienced this kind of a cast shakeup before. So again, there's still a lot of like back and forth to whether, again, it was planned or not, or specifically if the Meliswan portion was planned or not. And we do know that the actors were at least not let in on it if it was planned, but it definitely will go down as one of Days' greatest umbrella storylines. Like I said, it got a lot of criticism, but it sort of saved Days from the brink of cancellation, and we sort of can't be mad about that. So yeah, that was this week's Those Were Days Extended. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
Those were